Nick Sly, Denver branch executive with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. So great to have you back on the Business Brief.
Ryan, it's great to be here again today.
Nick, you and co-author Bethany Green recently released an article in the Rocky Mountain Economist looking at small business recovery in Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Can you share with us your key findings?
Yeah, I think, Ryan, thanks. I think one of the first things that stood out to us is the unevenness in the recovery that you see among small businesses and some of the other broader parts of the economy. Is really when you started to see the economy start to pick up and employment coming back. We started to see some manufacturing activity start to pick up over the last year. We didn't see that same growth and recovery among the small business community. We didn't really see it until the latter part or the early part of this year. So it was not until the spring of 2021 that we started to see employment really coming back in a meaningful way. But we started to see businesses reopening in a meaningful way among that small business community. And so I think the first thing that really stood out was the unevenness in that recovery. Now, one of the things I think that is my key takeaway from that is that the small business community, regardless of industry and where we are, that the small business community is a segment of the economy that's particularly vulnerable to the path of the pandemic and the path of the virus, because that recovery really started in earnest for small businesses when you started to see case counts come down and remain low for a while, and you started to see vaccination rates start to rise. So this small business community, I think, being particularly vulnerable to the path of the pandemic is pretty important here in Colorado, because compared to the rest of the nation, we do have more employment and we do have more small businesses as a share of the total output of our economy. So this is a particularly important segment here in Colorado.
Yeah, now, according to your analysis, Nick, and I quote here, the small businesses in the Rocky Mountain region that remained opened or were newly started were not the same type that typically drives significant job creation, and only recently has the number of small businesses that employ additional workers begun to recover, end quote. What does that mean for further recovery of small businesses in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region?
No, I think this was an important part of what we found in the analysis. We really found happening in the community around us is at first it looked like there might have been some traction that small businesses were gaining, that it might have been some growth and activity there as you started to see applications for new businesses pick up as perhaps a signal that small businesses were maybe not fully recovering the way they were before, but were transforming and able to be part of that broader recovery. But in fact, what we found is that many of those new businesses those applications that were being filed and those new businesses were being opened were in fact online retailers. And that was quite different than many of the retail shops, the small manufacturing outfits that we happen to see, or even the restaurants that we'd often have. And they differed in a meaningful way. Is the online retailers, while providing an important source of revenue when we had to socially distance, it was a good alternative mechanism. What you don't see is those online retailers often employing a lot of workers. On the other hand, when you see the small manufacturing shop or the retailer, the local business at the end of the street, when you saw the small leisure and hospitality company that tends to employ those 4 to 5 additional workers and has a small workforce that they bring on and even grows during the summer months, those were not the types of businesses that were really recovering. And so that's, I think, the first thing to say is when we see the type of business that was really starting to grow, the new small businesses was those online retailers. We didn't see those traditional small business employers, the engine of job growth that we often find to be so important in our community. That was not the part of the small business community that we saw growing. So what does that, I think, mean going forward? It means that when we think about that contribution from those small business owners and the few number of folks that they each hire that add up to close to a third of the Colorado economy of all employment, they're really only starting to get some traction in with the recovery. And so I think we want to monitor closely how this segment, this part of the small business community is responding to the changing conditions that we have and the outlook for Delta and other variants that are out there.
Right. And so many of us are obviously clearly thinking about going forward, how can we continue to support our small business community as we recover, and at some point, hopefully, we will truly emerge from this pandemic. What are you monitoring going forward as you think about the outlook for the small business community in Colorado and throughout the Rocky Mountain region?
there's a couple of things that I'm really trying to listen for and to look for. I think first, the most important thing is to hear from the small business community directly, and what is it that they're telling us? Because I think they are going to be the most forward-looking, especially compared to any of the other data or narratives that we actually see sitting out there. And the things that I'm starting to hear from them is that now when restaurants are in fact open, they're not able to be fully seated because there's fewer people coming in. We're starting to see demand come back and a little more hesitation. And this is at a time when it's the easiest to sit outside just because we have the weather. It's the easiest to convene that vaccination rates have never been higher. And so I think we're listening to the change in demand from small business owners. Other stories like gyms and other spas and healthcare facilities where you start to see what's the appetite that their consumers have for coming back in. And so the first thing we're listening to is how is that change in consumer appetites really manifesting as we start to get more news about potential changes in the path of the pandemic. The second thing that I'm really trying to monitor is how reliant and the small businesses might be on potential policies. Last year, we had PPP and we had other avenues for support, regulatory adjustments that allowed banks to work with their small businesses to actually provide some accommodation. I want to hear if they're finding that support or how reliant they might still be on that support. Are we really still getting growth coming from consumers and their willingness to be out and spend? Or are we seeing more reliance on their savings? Are we seeing more reliance on other types of programs and policies that are out there? I think that's a real indication to how the small business community is faring at this time.
Nick Sly with the Denver branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Ryan. Thank you.